Today I'm going to show you how I go about making this simple cabinet to box in our electric meter and consumer unit. I've literally made it out of scraps of MDF that were otherwise destined for the bin, and by the end of all this you're going to know all about standard cabinet dimensions. You're going to see a few of the design considerations that I had to take into account. We're going to cover different options for joining the wood together. We're also going to cover what you can do if you're building a cabinet where the doors aren't as tall as the entire unit. We'll have a quick look at standard dimensions for Euro hinges, and I'll tell you my #1 tip for getting a great finish when you're painting the edges of MDF. This is a great project to get started with basic cabinet making, and the skills you'll develop doing a project like this can be transferred to everything from wardrobes to alcove units. So I guess it's time to drink some coffee and make some stuff. So I've vaguely worked out the dimensions of what we need to build here. 970 tall, 600 wide. I've already got doors. It's going to be like 2 doors opening in the middle, if that makes sense. But it's designed for a 600 unit, so it'll be exactly 600 wide, 140 millimeters deep. One other thing I'll do, so I don't need to keep referring over to this notebook, which invariably I'll lose, is that I'm just going to quickly kind of write down the measurements and things on a little whiteboard here in the workshop, just as a little reminder as to what I'm actually going to be doing, because I will forget. In Europe, we generally use standard metric dimensions for cabinets, the most common width being 600 millimeters. That's the same as most kitchen appliances such as dishwashers and fridges. So if in doubt, go for 600 mil, you'll have the widest range of options for doors and other accessories. Most kitchens will obviously have a mix of units to fit the space, but they do all follow standard sizes. So for example, in our kitchen we've got 1000, 400, 600, 500, a 900 gap for the range, a 600 pan drawer, 300, 600, 600, 500, 600 and another 500 drawer unit on the end. Obviously if you're in a non-metric part of the world you can adjust things to your own standard sizes, but you get the general idea of how all this works. For our project I've bought off the shelf standard gloss white doors, 300mm wide each. You can make your own doors, I might cover that in a future video, but for this it's just easier to buy them off the shelf. I'll start off by making the carcass, and that means getting the table saw out. So a table saw is one of those tools that's great for very specific tasks, but I certainly don't advise buying one just for a project like this. I've made a video all about the dangers of a table saw, and there are many other ways of cutting wood that are far safer. However, table saws are really good for repeated narrow cuts that are all the same size, so it's really my go-to tool for a job like this. So I've marked a really faint level pencil line all the way across here at the exact height of the bottom of the boxing, and I've done the same on this side here, and then I'll measure down from that line to the floor so that I know exactly how long the legs need to be. I'll cut them to length first of all. And then for the top and bottom, we want the overall thing to be 600 wide, but we need to account for the thickness of the MDF, which is 2 lots of 18 millimeters, which means that the top and bottom need to be 564 mil. So then, for the top, I need to nibble out a bit where the cables are going to be coming through, and that is going to be hidden largely by this boxing, so I don't need to be particularly accurate. If anything, I just want to make sure I'm not taking too much away. So I've just put a mark here for the left-hand side, and the right-hand side can be around that mark there. And by the way, I'm just going to do a little mark on there so I remember that that is the top, that's the front. But then the bottom bit is going to need a little bit more thought put into how this is going to work. I don't want it too high, because if an electrician ever needs to get in to get access to these kind of earthing points around here, we don't want to obscure any of that, but at the same time, as I say, we don't want it too low down. Let's go for, I wouldn't go any higher than that, which is pretty much 100. The next decision we need to make is how we're going to join all of this together. And you've got loads of options here. I'm going to go for using the biscuit jointer. I'll tell you why in a minute. You can pick these up relatively cheaply these days, but if you haven't got one, don't panic if you are making a similar kind of project. You could screw it together. You could just countersink them, screw them through, fill them afterwards. I'm not doing that because, in my experience, you'll always see the filler. You could probably get away with literally just gluing the joint and brad nailing it together. It's not great, but it'll probably do the job. Modern wood glues are ridiculously strong, so if you clamped it up, a couple of brads in that with the glue, it'll probably be fine. Another option that would probably work quite well in this sort of scenario actually is pocket hole screws. The advantage of that is that you're then not going to have any holes to fill at all, but the route I'm going to go down, as I say, biscuit jointing it. The main reason for using a biscuit jointer for a job like this is it's going to make alignment much, much easier. These are biscuits, by the way. I'm just using number 20s. So the key thing with using a biscuit jointer, you can either reference off the base or you can reference off the fence. It really doesn't matter which you do, as long as you use the same reference edge for both sides of the joint. If you end up using the base for one bit and the fence for the other bit, they're not going to line up properly. So I'm going to need a couple of slots in the edge of that board there, and I'm going to need a couple of slots in the top end of this board here. I think the easiest way to do this is going to be to reference off the fence. So I'll get all of those slots cut and come back to you once we're ready for some assembly. For these sort of cuts where obviously I can't reference off an edge as such, I'm having to use a little jig, a little guide block here, and it means I can't use the fence, which is fine because for this bottom edge, the distance isn't particularly critical as long as it matches the other side. That means it'll be horizontal. So I'm just going to line up to the marks I've put on my little guide piece here and pop a couple of slots in. And as easy as that, we are ready for glue up. Now, in an ideal world, I'd assemble the whole thing kind of on a nice flat bench that way round, because that would keep everything really nicely aligned for us, but I simply don't have the room to do that. So I'm going to have to assemble it this way, and it's probably all going to get a bit cack-handed, but we will do our best, because needs must. So I'm going to let it dry kind of at floor level like that. It's as square as a square thing, all tightly clamped up. We'll leave that overnight to dry and then we're on to the next bit. So, next thing we need to have a little think about here. Obviously, where's it going left, right wise? I don't want it hard pressed up against this so that when an electrician comes in, you don't want it being ridiculously difficult to get any of this equipment out. You want to make access as easy as possible for the next trade coming along. So I think around there is going to be pretty much perfect. So I'm just going to mark out where this main incomer electric feed comes in, and I've just put a couple of marks on the MDF at the bottom here. And then we've also got these wires here that we need to cater for as well. So I've just put a mark there on the left and right, and I've measured the distance from the wall so we know it comes out to around there. So the only other cutout we're going to have is for this cable here, and I've just put a mark on the side there, so it should be around there. I'm going to be careful not to take too much out, but that's a relatively easy one. And then I'm going to trim the skirtings on the left and right. I'm going to actually trim the skirting board off. I'm not going to scribe this around the skirting board. I'll do that once I've done all of these other cutouts. And then the only other thing that I want to have a think about now is where the door is going to be sitting. So we've got two doors like this. It's going to open kind of like that. So obviously we could go right at the top like that. We could go right at the bottom like that. But I think what I'd like to do again is make life as easy as possible for any electricians coming along. So I'm going to drop the door down a little bit, and I'm just going to put a mark on the MDF here, and we'll put an infill panel at the top and at the bottom. One consideration here though is normally with cabinet doors, this part of the cabinet at the top and bottom is going to prevent the door from swinging all the way inwards, and because we're not going to have that because of the infills, then I'm going to have to put a little bit of beading on the back of the infill to stop the door from swinging all the way inwards. That's absolutely fine. I'll do that at the top and bottom, but as long as I know what height the door's going at, then we can get on with the next bit of woodworking on this. So the next job is to scribe this to the wall, because this wall, this is an old wall, it's never going to be flat in a million years. In order to scribe this to the back wall, what we need to do, obviously we want this front to be perfectly plumb. So I've got the spirit level out. I'm just going to check that that is vertical, which it is, absolutely perfect. Cats are going crazy. And all I'm going to do, I like to use a bare pencil for this, so a bare wood pencil. We sell these on the Gosforth Handyman shop if you're ever after these, because they don't mark the wall. And all I'm going to do is run the pencil up the side of here. And by the way, this method only really works if the furthest distance away from the wall is the thickness of the pencil to the lead, which it happens to be here. That'll make more sense once you try doing this job. But basically, if it's a bigger gap than that, you might want to use like a pair of compasses, or you can use a washer and just follow a washer, like a little wheel, all the way down the wall. But for this, the thickness of the pencil works fine. So as I say, just following the wall there, it's just that little kind of bulge in the plaster there that we need to take out. Don't think we need anything down the bottom, but bearing in mind, behind the skirting board here, we can take as much as we want out, but I don't think, are we hitting? We might be hitting the wall behind there actually, so I'll just mark where the top of the skirting board is, so I'll mark a shape just around that like that. That is kind of, we don't want to go any further than that because you'll be able to see it. But what we can do is just take a little bit of this bottom section out here, just to make sure that that's not hitting the wall in a place that we can't actually see it. I'll do that on the other side as well, and then we should be good to go. So we're on the home straight now. I've filled all the little tiny holes from the brad nails. I've just used this wood filler. You can use any filler you want for that. They're tiny holes. As long as you sand them down, you'll never ever see them. I've just used my random orbit sander to give everything a nice sand down, all of the edges and everything like that. But I want to show you one key stage now that people often miss out, and this can make all of the difference as to whether or not your finish is going to look mediocre or quite good. So first of all, I've knocked down all of these little sharp edges, just really gently. You want the edges to be nice and clean, but you don't want them to be literally so sharp that you could potentially kind of cut yourself on them. So you're just going to once or twice run a piece of, this is 120 grit, 100 grit I'm using here, just once or twice over all of the edges so that everything has just been very gently knocked down, even on all these little corners and stuff like that. You're not rounding over, you're just making sure nothing's sharp. And then give everything a quick wipe down, because this next stage is absolutely key if you want a nice finish on your MDF, especially on like these edges, because otherwise you'll get fluffy edges. Loads of people think that you can't paint MDF and get a good finish on these edges. You absolutely can, and the quality of the MDF doesn't even make that much difference. I mean, I've got a bit of a mix here because obviously this is all leftover scraps of wood. This is definitely moisture resistant MDF. These side bits, I've no idea if they're moisture resistant or not. A common myth, by the way, is that moisture-resistant MDF is always green. It's not. You can get non-green moisture-resistant MDF. But either way, even if it wasn't moisture-resistant, we'd still get a good finish on this. So don't panic too much about that. If it was going in a bathroom or something like that, I would be a bit more concerned about it. In a utility room, I really couldn't care less. And it's going to be so well painted and sealed up, it's really going to make no difference anyway. But this little trick with MDF, if you do this, you will never have fluffy edges on MDF ever again, and your edges will look awesome. And I've made lots of videos about painting MDF, by the way, so I'll include some links in the description if you want a little bit more detail on it. But to cut a long story short, seal your edges with a bit of primer. We're not doing all of the finishing. All I'm doing is sealing the edges. So any bare cut edges, I'm not bothered about the face grain at the minute. That'll get done when we properly finish it, once it's well, Mrs. Mack's doing that. But what I want to do is get all of the sanding out the road before Mrs. Mack takes over and does the final painting of the unit. And that means sealing the edges, waiting on it to dry, and then giving it one last sand. You see, the general principle here is that when MDF gets wet with the paint, and this is water-based paint, when MDF gets wet, the edge of the MDF, the edge grain, kind of fluffs up a little bit, and you get these like little fluffy bits that stick out the MDF, and it'll only really do that once. But if you do this method of painting it, then sanding it, then doing your final coat of paint, it'll not fluff up again, almost guaranteed, unless you're using really poor quality MDF. But generally speaking, any normal brand of MDF, certainly anything you would buy in any UK DIY outlet these days, it's pretty good quality. You don't need to always be going for your Medites and Chronospans and stuff, but often it is Medite and Chronospan anyway, just white labelled for the big DIY stores. And obviously, if you're in a part of the world where you struggle to get hold of decent quality MDF, what you might need to do is do this a couple of times. But if you're dealing with fairly kind of average quality MDF, and I'm using an acrylic primer undercoat here, water-based, get it on all your edges, let the edges fluff up as much as they want, sand it down, and honestly, you'll have a mirror finish on all your edges. You'll never have problems with the edges of MDF ever again. And by the way, I'm relatively confident that once this is done, you'll not see any of the joins in the MDF, or at least that's the plan. And just go round, make sure there's no like blobs of paint on any of the edges. This will dry in probably a couple of hours and we'll be ready to sand it. There we go. Right, leave that for a bit, come back in 2 hours. Right, a couple of hours later, and hopefully you can see how the end grain of the MDF is kind of fluffed up. And all we're going to do now, very, very gently, is sand that back. Now, you can use just normal sandpaper if you want. I'm very used to doing it with my random orbit sander, but if you are going to use an electric machine, just be really careful that you don't take too much off. We're just going to be really quick, really gentle here. And that is it. That is now as smooth as the face grain, and that is ready to take another coat of primer and then the final coat of paint. So that's another job ticked off the list, and I'm really pleased with how this has turned out. Mrs. Mac has done a great job with the finishing as per usual, and I even found some dinky little brass knobs to match all of the other brass hardware that's already in this room. Obviously this is a utility room, so this doesn't need to look particularly fancy, but if you wanted to tart up a project like this, you could follow the skirting board all the way around the bottom, and you could also add a few little mouldings and trims, but as I say, it's a utility room and I think it looks absolutely great as it is. I'm not generally a fan of leaving MDF edges on display, and I was initially thinking of adding a little solid oak top to match the floor onto this, but Mrs. Mac has done such a good job with the painting that you literally can't see the joins between the bits of wood, so I'm more than happy to leave it like that. These joins might become a little bit more obvious over time as the MDF absorbs a tiny amount of moisture from the atmosphere, so it's always something I could easily add later down the line, but for now I'm really happy with this finish and it really tidies this whole area up. I do have a slightly more fancy cabinet to build for the entrance hall, so if you want to see how that unfolds, watch this space. Don't forget to hit subscribe. But for now, I think we can wrap this project up. The utility room is now officially properly finished. So for now, folks, as per usual, be nice to one another, look after each other, and we shall see you next time. Tatty bye.